The south of Russia is on fire, Tuapse. Once again, many have been missed. Film it, look. It's burning. Rostov region. The railway is ablaze. Ukrainian flamingos are already in action. Trump can keep his tomahawks for himself.
The flamingo surpasses the tomahawk in two ways at once. First, it's the flight range, and it also surpasses it in warhead weight.
Ukraine is placing an order. 25 Patriot systems from the US are already in the plans. Another of Putin's heroes couldn't take it, surrendered, and gave up the base of the pro-Kremlin old man.
They're sending us to certain death. And Putin is a bastard and a pig. And may he die.
In Russia, the stage of acceptance continues. Russians are being prepared for eternal war.
We will not achieve victory in the way we dream of. And that's why...
What do you mean?
Because we won't get it. It's a process, really.
Pokrovsk is an important direction. Right now, it's the hottest spot on the front. We'll show you exclusive footage from there in just a few minutes. Or even seconds, I'd say. Footage of the city being cleared of Russian invaders. It's very important to see this with your own eyes. Besides that, Russia itself is on fire from the south all the way to Bashkortostan. In Tuapse, the long-suffering port is burning vividly. Ukrainian naval drones did their job. And in Bashkiria, 4 Russian logistics facilities have been destroyed. Meanwhile, a new problem has arisen for the mobilized soldiers of the Russian Federation. The Russian army is suffering colossal tank losses. More than 11,000 tanks have been destroyed since the start of the full-scale war. And this, my friends, is not the end. We've gathered all the most important facts from the front and military topics in a report, and after that I'll be waiting for you in the studio to discuss them with an expert.
We must not only keep pace with the global economy, yes. We should strive to outpace its dynamics by unlocking our own potential.
But in Russia, there is neither dynamism nor potential to be seen. In particular, even the most resilient are starting to collapse. For example, the Russian military giant Uralvagonzavod, which produces armored vehicles and enjoys all the privileges of the military-industrial complex, can't cope and is falling apart at the seams.
What is the plant's management doing? Well, they don't formally fire people, but they switch them to a 4-day work week with a 20% pay cut, or a 3-day work week with a 40% pay cut. This is exactly what's happening right now. But even that is no longer helping. And this stage has already happened. According to the latest statistics, about 250,000 people in Russia have been working like this recently.
And now even reducing shifts to a minimum no longer works. At the Enterprise, that is the flagship of Russian tank manufacturing, layoffs are coming. This was reported by the Russian publication E1. In some departments, up to 50% of the staff is expected to be cut, and across the entire enterprise, 1 in 10 employees will lose their job.
Previously, it was kind of like this. Civilian production might not have been very profitable, but there was a lot of money for military products, and that somehow made up for it. But now it seems that even spending on military products is being cut, and it looks like the railcar plant is no longer making profits from military contracts. It can't cover the losses from the civilian sector, so now they're going to lay off people in civilian production, reportedly about 10%.
Experts explain that the reason for all this is the incredible decline of the Russian economy. Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries, which are depriving Russia of millions in petrodollars, Western sanctions, and increased pressure from the US on the Russian oil industry, have already led to a situation where even the negative forecasts for the economy are inaccurate. It will get even worse.
Their negative forecast from the central bank, let me remind you, is a GDP decline of 2.5 to 3.5%, inflation at 12%, and an interest rate of 20%. In other words, they will have to raise the rate back up to 20% next year. And that's their negative scenario, which I don't even consider negative. It's just the current reality. That's the point. The thing is, the accumulated problems, they just keep coming up every day, and they prevent the central bank from maintaining the scenario it considers manageable.
The situation has escalated to the point where the economic decline in Russia has to be publicly acknowledged.
Question: is that enough? Is this what we wanted?
In fact, even according to official data, the recession has already affected 19 out of 24 sectors of the Russian economy. Moreover, they're even starting to have problems with defense industry enterprises. If these enterprises are already experiencing non-payments, not getting paid from the budget, and the work week is being reduced, like for example Ural wagon plant, this means their funding was cut, well, about 3 months ago. So these processes are actually happening.
At the same time, the funniest thing is that in Russia, they've already figured out how to present this information to the higher-ups. Everything is in the spirit of negative growth and unsuccessful successes. So now people are openly talking about the economic decline while adding that there was such an unprecedented boom before that it simply couldn't last forever. So now we are witnessing
There has been a noticeable decrease in the measured value, which has raised concerns among those monitoring the situation. In response to this decline, a solution has been proposed. The solution involves implementing targeted strategies to address the causes of the decrease and to help restore stability.
naturally suggested itself to once again revise the budget project, of course in the direction of negative growth.
We are conducting a whole series meetings on the framework of the country's main financial document, its key priorities.
And as before, the priority remains the war, so analysts are not advising to expect any improvements. If the cuts have already affected the industrial giants of the military-industrial complex, then all enterprises in the country, including private ones, are next in line.
So Alexander Kovalenko, a military expert whom you know well, is joining our broadcast. Alexander, hello, we're glad to see you.
Good evening.
Let's start our conversation with Pokrovsk, of course. The latest news is that the enemy is ramping up assault operations. I want to ask you, where is this all heading? The 7th Air Assault Corps reports that over the past week, they have eliminated 240 Russians and wounded 136. They destroyed 1 tank, 3 armored fighting vehicles, and also 23 units of automotive and motorized equipment. And this is just the 7th Air Assault Corps. And what is the situation right now? And I understand that making predictions is a thankless task, but I still want to hear your opinion. What do you think will happen in the coming days?
Near Pokrovsk, the defensive operation continues, which primarily consists of stabilizing actions by the Ukrainian defense forces. The situation is stabilizing, and specifically, stabilization measures are being carried out in the central part of the city, and logistics are being provided to the northern part, which is completely held by Ukrainian forces. So as of today, Pokrovsk can be divided into 3 such zones. This is the southern zone, the Lazurny neighborhood, the Yuzhny neighborhood, Leontovichi, Troyanda, and Rosa, which are held by Russian forces, where they have entrenched themselves and have a direct zone of control. There is the central part of Pokrovsk, which again includes Pervomaika, the center, Sobachevka, and Rok. This is the area where infiltration by Russian sabotage groups has been carried out quite intensively over the past few weeks. And our clearing teams are conducting corresponding operations there. So this is a zone of active combat operations. And then there's the northern part beyond the railway, which is currently held by Ukrainian forces and is a strategically important area that provides cover for logistics to Mirnohrad.
All right, let's talk about something else now. Our strikes on Russia and on the temporarily occupied Crimea, there have been new successes here. Special operations forces struck the Hvardiyske oil depot in occupied Crimea, for example. Tell us why it is important for the occupiers, and then we'll move on to the strikes on Russian territory itself.
Overall, on the territory of the temporarily occupied Crimean Peninsula, almost any base, oil depot, or civilian facility that once served such a purpose has been repurposed for military use. They are used not so much to meet the needs of the civilian population, but specifically for military purposes. That's why they should be viewed in this context, especially when we're talking about supplying the Russian occupation forces. In the temporarily occupied south of Ukraine, that is the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, these are essentially transit locations for the temporary storage and dispatch of the relevant fuels and lubricants. If we're talking about a certain base or an ammunition storage depot, again, it serves the relevant functions for supplying and providing logistical support to the Dnipro Task Force Group. This is precisely the group that holds the temporarily occupied part of the left bank Kherson region and part of the Zaporizhia region. In other words, the entire southern group is also supplied through Crimea. Strikes on any military installations and dual-use facilities in Crimea are, of course, not just about impacting the Crimean Peninsula itself, or about destroying enemy equipment and highly expensive, sophisticated air defense assets on its territory. But in a certain sense, this also notably affects the overall degree, the specific level, and the broad scale of logistical support for the Russian military grouping in the mainland region of southern Ukraine.
I also want to discuss with you the strikes on Tuapse, the long-suffering port, which is burning once again. This time, maritime drones were used, and it is noted that the drone regime lasted for almost 8 hours. The danger persisted in this area for quite some time. Yes. Well, yes, overall, it's important information that the strikes again took place over the waters of the Black Sea. Please tell us about these targets. How do you assess them?
As I understand it, once again, the vital oil infrastructure in the port was targeted, as well as the vessels that were transporting.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
This raw material, plus the terminals that were responsible for loading this raw material onto the appropriate tanker vessels. And indeed, Tuapse is under significant pressure, just like any other important facility that supports the economy of the Russian Federation, the Russian Federation's budget, through the export of various products. For example, if we're talking about energy resources, and not only those, it is under attack. Ukraine, in turn, is demonstrating that the Russian Federation is unable to protect and provide cover for such important facilities on its own territory. This once again highlights that Russia's capabilities, or rather its tools, for countering such attacks are lacking. They are, let's say, rapidly diminishing regardless of whether it's a maritime threat, sea drones, or an aerial threat, airborne drones.
Alexander, and in Sterlitamak, Bashkortostan, equipment from 3 communication towers was burned, as well as a relay cabinet for the railway, according to the GUAR. All of these are objects of Russian logistics. Essentially, this is a struggle against the logistical supplies of the Russian army that has been ongoing since the start of the full-scale invasion. Could you please tell us how much attention is currently being paid to this area, and what prospects do you see specifically in the need to destroy logistical chains, especially those at the front?
Yes, indeed, when any information about the execution of certain operations or strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation appears in the news, of course, the first thing reported is about oil refineries because they burn so brightly and spectacularly explode, and it's quite a show. It attracts more viewers, more popularity. In second place, you could say, are the strikes on Russian thermal power plants, which cause blackouts in some Russian cities and a gradual impact. To the tightening of the blackout ring around the Moscow region and Moscow itself. But when we talk about logistics, this news tends to go largely unnoticed. It doesn't get much attention. It's mentioned, yes, but it doesn't really attract any particular hype. It doesn't really generate much excitement, even though logistics plays a very important role in supplying the Russian occupation forces and in general in Russia. In principle, logistics is very complicated because just like with the flow of electricity through the relevant facilities, thermal power plants, substations, and so on, it's the same with logistics. There are certain key points, and damage to them forces detours that can take several hours or sometimes even longer. Railway logistics within the Russian Federation itself is not so well developed. It doesn't have such a wide network. It's not so extensive that in the event of damage to a particular node, you could simply reroute, lose half an hour or an hour, for example, but not lose anything at all when it comes to supplying the troops. This applies to all matters of material and technical supply. In Russia, things are much worse. Damage to a key node, which is a crucial and essential part of the infrastructure, can lead to catastrophic problems in an entire region, or even an entire federal subject, I would say. The railway itself may not function properly for a considerable period of time. That is why this is a very important area when it comes to disrupting the timely supply of Russian occupation forces. And if the relevant facilities are damaged or destroyed, requiring, let's say, long-term repairs, This could have serious consequences for the entire logistics system across the Russian Federation.
Alexander, there's one more topic I'd like to discuss. I want to talk to you about Russian tanks. At the beginning of our segment, there was information that 11,000 of them have been destroyed since the start of the full-scale invasion. The Russians are preparing a rearmament program right now, and this primarily concerns armored vehicles. Please tell us, it seems like they have very few tanks left in reserve, yet how actively are they currently participating in the war? What dangers could arise during rearmament? What scale and objectives of the enemy can we talk about?
Nothing has changed for Russia when it comes to tank production. The only plant they have that manufactures tanks from scratch is Ural Vagonzavod. This is the facility where T-90 tanks are produced. And per month, they produce about enough for a company set. That is, it's around 11 to 12, up to 11 to 12 T-90 tanks per month. All the other facilities, all the other lines, they are engaged in restoring the remaining stockpiles from Soviet times. For the most part, these aren't even the T-72B3 tanks, the B modification, but rather their much older counterpart, the T-72A. And at the other plants, there is no production. For example, Omsk-Transmash has fewer than 100 T-80 tanks in storage for modernization, reactivation, repairs, and so on. I think that by the end of this year, and even at the beginning of next year, Omsk-Transmash will be completely out of these tank reserves and will survive solely by modernizing and repairing what they already have, what gets damaged in the combat zone and is brought to them for repairs. They will no longer be able to produce tanks, and accordingly, they won't be able to create anything new either. So Russia is in a very bad situation with tanks. But on the other hand, throughout 2025, the Russian army has, in a systematic, confident, and, one has to admit, rather effective way, switched to using infantry. Well, how effective is it really? They simply don't value human lives. They have completely shifted to relying on the infantry component. Instead of armored vehicles, they use light transport vehicles. Zhigulis, Nivas UAZs, and the Bukhanka van. They use motorcycles and sometimes even electric scooters. There's all sorts of things. And of course, it sounds funny and like a joke if it weren't for the verified videos and photos showing them actually going on assaults on electric scooters. Well, things like that do happen. And infantry. Infantry, a large amount of infantry. So tanks now rarely play the role of assault Wunderwaffe. When they do, they're already something far removed from actual tanks. More like hangars, sheds, anything you can imagine, covered with a massive amount of protective gear against drones. Their only purpose is to break through the defensive line, reach the line of contact, and deploy troops. So, in a way, the tank has even started to perform the function of an armored personnel carrier. They have long since lost their original function, at least in the way they are used by the Russian Federation. And overall, I don't think this practice will return unless we're talking about a conflict where there is no dominance of FPV drones, where the concept of a kill zone doesn't exist. Well, for example, in a war against one of the European countries as an option, where again, there is an absence of the line of defense, strong points, fortifications, kill zones, and FPV drones could actually work to Russia's advantage, which is not just saving tanks right now. It's important to understand that everyday repairs are being carried out. There is some limited production, repair, modernization, and restoration of old Soviet stock from whatever remains. And considering that losses in the combat zone are extremely low, although in 2022, 2023, and 2024, the losses were simply catastrophic compared to those years, now they are sustaining minimal losses. So unfortunately, there is also a process of accumulation taking place, and this is a dangerous trend.
Thank you very much. Alexander Kovalenko, military analyst, was live on Ukraine Today. All the best, Alexander. Goodbye.
All the best.